And this is a very special Sunday for us. Welcome to First Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Bristol. I'm the Reverend Nancy Sokup. Friends, right where we're standing was ground zero for King Philip's War, which has now been considered, historians have said it was an American genocide. So I know that's a grim note to begin with, but Dave has done so much to lift up the life and culture and presence of the indigenous peoples before there was ever even this building. Dave, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Didn't expect applause. So nice, Nancy, to be back here, because this is where in many ways, where I started my journey. I worked with Diane over here about 7 years ago to put together the interpretive sign that you have in front of the church, talking about the beginnings of this town. But since that time, I've learned a whole lot more and done a whole lot more. I now have, I think, 8 more interpretive signs around. And most recently, I've been privileged to work with Tony over here, Tony Martini, on getting a land acknowledgement through the town council here, which was adopted on September 18th. And you'll hear more about that when Tony talks about this in the Q&A afterwards. But that's one of 2 historical events, the land acknowledgement adoption. And the second event is coming up next year, actually June 21st, was the outbreak of King Philip's War. Right where the Kickamuit Middle School is in Warren, and I have an interpretive sign there if you ever want to stop by and read that. The war broke out there and then ended here at Mount Hope with the death of Philip or Metacom. So we are really, this community is the bookends of that war in that sense. And I am working on a day-long event mark this on your calendar for Saturday, June 21st, 2025. We'll probably do this over in Swansea, and I've invited both the historian for the tribe and Eric Schultz, who wrote one of the more definitive books about the King Philip War. And you get a chance to, if we work things out, to travel around on a bus tour and see some of those original sites. The history's all here. You just have to know where to look for it. So, though the King Philip War was not the sole direct cause of all the problems that plagued Massachusetts during the troubled decades of the late 17th century, it was the first in a series of crises and events that set the tone for the whole period. In June 1675, King Philip's War erupted in Plymouth Colony, and though the colonists could not have known it at the time, the conflict initiated a long, far-reaching period of adversity. The majority of colonists held the view that the natives had no just reason to harbor animosity toward the English. To the contrary, Indians of Metacom's band complained about the many points in their relations with the English colonists. In a parley with the native chief known as King Philip, just before the initiation of hostilities, a group of Rhode Island magistrates heard a list of grievances. That took place right where the Mount Hope Bridge is, on the shore there. And it was an effort to try to fend off rumors of hostilities. But essentially, what Philip said was the Indians had done no wrong, but the English had wronged them. The troubles dated back to the early days of the colony when Metacom's father, the Massasoit Usamiquan, who, if you want to visit him, he's reburied up in Burrs Hill Park in Warren. That's right. That's how I discovered all this. Usamakwan was a great man at the time, and the English, when they arrived in 1620, were like a little child. The Poconokeets constrained the other other tribes who wanted, particularly the Narragansetts and the Massachusetts, didn't want them here, but Usamakwan persuaded all of the tribes under him to accept their presence, and in fact, as we all know from the classic Thanksgiving stories, helped them by teaching them how to plant corn. But they did far more than that in terms of teaching them how to survive here, and had they not had that, they would not have survived. Either would have all died here or gone back to England. Since then, though, the tables turned, and most of the chief's complaints centered on the colonists' land dealings. The colonists often claimed more land than was originally agreed upon, and Metacom felt that the Indians could not get a fair hearing from the colonial courts or authorities. As the author Michael Puglisi pointed out, the myopic view that the English were innocent of any affront against the native allowed the Puritan leaders to attribute the war to God's punishment of the colonists for their own sins. The violent eruption by the unconverted Indians brought a viral flood of literature condemning the colonists' wrongdoings. Among New England's sins, the Governor's Council cited a neglect of discipline in the churches, an evil pride in apparel and hairstyles, toleration of Quakers and their damnable heresies, much disorder and rudeness in the youth, profanity by common swearing and cursing in ordinary communication, and possibly the most shameless and scandalous of all, the council condemned the loose and sinful custom of going or riding from town to town, oftentimes men and women together, upon the pretense of going to lecture, when the true purpose was merely to drink and revel in the taverns. The largest problem for most New Englanders was they simply could not view the Indians as rational beings driven by human needs and desires. The English writers characterized their enemies as irredeemable members of the animal kingdom. Does this remind you of how immigrants have been described just 2 weeks ago by a former president of ours? In 1676, Nathaniel Saltonstall likely likened native warriors to wolves and beasts of prey. If Indians were not fully human, their complaints and injustices could be ignored. Since New Englanders viewed the war solely as God's punishment for their own backsliding, they could not recognize that natives had a legitimate motive for their actions to drive the English out. In the end, the New England colonies finally defeated Metacom and his allied bands during the summer of 1676, and virtually all New England writers, consistent with their earlier views of the war itself, attributed the victory in the war to the will of God, who allowed them to find some way to cut off the bloody and deceitful enemies of his people. Just as they had preached throughout the conflict, the Puritan leadership viewed the outcome as a sign that the New England congregations had reformed their ways sufficiently. After the colonies suffered setback upon setback due to their lack of repentance, signs of God's returning favor finally appeared in 1676 with the killing of Philip at Mount Hope. And God himself hath sent from heaven and saved us, wrote an anonymous New Englander. Just as they had explained that God employed a supposedly heathen and satanic people to punish their backsliding, the New England faithful had no trouble believing that their loving God would turn on the natives who carried out his plan. In this view, the Almighty used the Indians as pawns to accomplish his ends, and then cast them aside when they were of no use to him. The lesson they drew from the whole experience was that God intended the mission, their errand to keep expanding into the wilderness, should continue. Perhaps if New Englanders had been able to recognize the real issues which drove Metacom's people to hostilities, the trauma of the Indian War might have affected them less seriously. The beliefs of Puritanism were so ingrained in the region, however, that the colonial authorities saw the hand of God controlling all events which affected his people, far more than merely an attempt by the natives to repel the incursions of English culture. New Englanders perceived the conflict as the Lord's punishment for backsliders, as a call for repentance, and finally as a message for continuation of the assigned errand. Therefore, all King Philip's War officially ended in 1676. Its legacies lingered on as the colonists struggled to rebuild their estates, their communities, their institutions, and their mission during the troubled decades that followed. The majority of land in Bristol was simply taken in a ceremony following the war. The ceremony was very simple. Ingraham stood his stand upon the land in the company with Wally and his associates, Wally Street here. And he broke a twig and picked up a cloud of dirt from the land and ground it beneath their feet. That's how the land of Bristol that was settled in 1680 was taken. Though the Pokanoket leaders who remained alive following the war could have negotiated a peaceful sale of land, giving them a chance to retain some of their homeland, such ideas were never considered. All native land would henceforth remain in colonial hands, and the Pokanoket survivors of the war would be enslaved, driven out, or some hung on the Boston Common. The way the war ended set the standard for how Native people would be treated for the next century, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. While Native voices continued to protest, the newly formed American government would legalize land grabs and Native genocide well into the 20th century. Only in the past few decades has the national conscience been awakened to the damage that these policies have caused, and the first meager steps taken toward reconciliation. Not to worry, the word reconcile was removed from the land acknowledgement here in Bristol. This church, however, could begin to take steps toward reconciliation, if you haven't already, which I believe you have. Like the Newman Congregational Church, in East Providence, you could undertake a project to learn about the history and the culture of your Pokanoket neighbors, and that's what's coming up, I believe. You could learn about their aspirations and values, and you might discover that you have much to share with them, such as your concern for the natural environment. You might take your responsibility seriously to love the people who were once seen as your enemy and lead the community in healing and greater understanding of the past. As the World Council of Churches states, love, as taught by Jesus of Nazareth, is radical. It heals and restores and confronts and transforms. It calls us to love our enemies, restore justice, and make community with those pushed to the margins. It indicts systems and cultures that discriminate and dehumanize. It empowers the disempowered and remembers the dismembered. As such, Christ's love is subversive and offensive to the systems and cultures that dominate, discriminate, and dehumanize. Such love alone can make reconciliation lasting and unity real. Thank you.
I can't think of a better challenge for us in terms of thinking about reconciliation. And I'm so honored that, Dave, you came and spoke such important words for us. I think Dave has given us a project, and I hope the confirmation class and the Sunday school will join me in that project. And I'm so ever so grateful that you're here today. I really am.